All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining the Expanding Payer-Provider Landscape in FHIR presentation. Today, our speaker is going to be Dr. Viet Nguyen. He is an internist, pediatrician, clinical informaticist, and consultant to government and commercial organizations in developing interoperable workflows and technologies. He has over 15 years of experience in health IT, focused on interoperability standards and product development. Formerly the CMIO for Lockheed Martin and Leidos Corporation, Dr. Nguyen is a nationally recognized FHIR educator, a FHIR Foundation board member, CMO for the Health Services Platform Consortium, and technical director for the HL7 Davinci project. Viet, would you like to take it away, sir? Mute buttons get us all. Fantastic.
Great, thank you, Joshua. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, folks, for wherever you are in the world. We'll skip this part. So thank you for joining me today in this little bit of an update, but a little bit of a dive into the HL7 Davinci project. I have two sessions during DevDays. This one will be more of an overview of what we're doing in Davinci and an update on where our activities lie. And then there is another session tomorrow that will be a deeper dive into the developer and implementer support resources that the Davinci community has put together to help you all implement our guides. So recognizing we have a worldwide audience and you're here to kind of learn about the FHIR landscape, let me tell you a little bit about Davinci and where we came from. Really, Davinci is now close to 3.5 years old. We were created in 2018 to really address the challenges of interoperability that was being faced by the provider, payer, vendor community around the administrative aspects of healthcare delivery. We all recognize, and you're here talking about FHIR and learning about FHIR, so you recognize the challenge of interoperability that we've had historically of point-to-point communications and the challenges of implementing and maintaining these connections. So I don't have to sell you on that point, thankfully, and hopefully I don't even have to sell you on the point around FHIR since you're already here. But I think you all could recognize the value of working together as this FHIR community, identifying important use cases for improving interoperability, and then working together to develop implementation guides so that we can give the community a set of standard operating procedures, a sense, to use FHIR in their workflows to, number one, improve efficiency, but as a clinician, a big theme is to reduce the burden. The burdens on providers, the burden on their support staff, and the burden on payers in getting information back and forth, and ultimately improving care and reducing burden for patients. So we bought in on the FHIR journey, at least this community did. I bought in about 6 or 7 years ago. And so this is lays the foundation of why we exist. In 2021, we have about 50 members, ranging from provider members, EHR vendors, payers, large-scale deployment partners, and of course, a number of vendors and industry partners to help promote what we do. So this is an important summary slide of the use cases. So originally when we started with Davinci, we thought we would try to tackle maybe 9 IGs and do a couple a year. And after we kicked off, a number of additional use cases were identified, and over the course of the last 3.5 years, we have developed, validated, published, and developed reference implementations for 11 guides, which if you've been in the HL7 community, you'll realize that's quite a bit of work. So they range from a number of different categories, from quality improvement to prior authorization, or here burden reduction around prior authorization. In the sender, IGs related to improving patient and member access to their clinical administrative data. On the right is the clinical data exchange, IGs and use cases to improve the exchange of clinical administrative data between payers and providers, as well as payers and other payers on behalf of the patient. And then the underlying things that we want to do to help develop implementation guides to support value-based care, or where member attribution and the notion of risk adjustment are important. The next slide is actually the same set of guides, but we've added some dials to help you get a sense and appreciation of how these guides have reached a level of maturity. So the dark dials with the arrows pointed way to the right are really around how mature the guides are, and they're published in STU1 versions and have been picked up. And then the dials are really around how many of them are starting to be put into production. So a number of them are starting to be in production as well. And so this is helpful for you, along with the darkened boxes, kind of orange, brown, tan boxes that show that these are guides that are identified or referenced in CMS rulemaking, which is really important because it's an appreciation not only from the FHIR community, but from regulators that FHIR is an important aspect of the future roadmap for interoperability for the healthcare IT community across the US. There are a couple of the few on the left hand, on the bottom left, that were identified in some proposed rules that are now being reevaluated by CMS, and we're awaiting their decision on whether or not they release them as final rules, they re-release them for comment, or some other plan. So if you're looking for a one-page summary of where we are in Davinci, this is the one-page summary. We have had a number of our implementation guides published since October, as well as a recent one in February for the phase 1 of member attribution. I'll go into each of these guides briefly during the course of the remaining 40 minutes or so. We have some actually upcoming publications. The Data Exchange for Quality Measures is in the publishing process, so we hopefully will have that published in the very near future. And then we have a couple that are in the process of ballot reconciliation and ultimately publishing around CDEX and the Health Record Exchange. We have a couple of new use cases around risk adjustment that are now in public calls in HL7 that anyone can join. And then we are finishing up some member discovery work to help scope the work we want to do around patient cost transparency. Coming up in the near future, we are currently working on the next version of the member attribution to focus on fee-for-service and the CMS data point of care approaches to attribution, and hope to take these to ballot in January or in the late fall for member attribution. We've been participating, as always, in HL7 events around Connectathons. We also had a Davinci education event, a full week-long event with over 300 participants, and we will be participating in the upcoming July CMS Connectathon, and we'll be presenting our implementation guides, and our use case leads will be leading mini Connectathon activities for folks who are wanting to bring in their technology, doing some testing. So if you haven't heard of it, you can go to hl7.org under the events page and find out more. It's a free event, so anyone can join, and it will be virtual. So looking at the work we do in Davinci, the core work that we do is identifying these use cases, which I just kind of briefly went over, then prioritizing them, and what the members of Davinci do as FHIR accelerators is that they contribute a combination of their financial resources as well as their subject matter expertise and time in order to prioritize and fund these use cases so that we can take them from a discovery. We go from a high level understanding to figure out what's the scope of the use case, and then fund the work of experts in HL7 standards process and FHIR and software development to work with the HL7 and the broader community to elaborate the business requirements, define the data requirements, and then do the FHIR gap analysis to see what we have to do in terms of creating profiles, authoring IGs, and balloting them and putting them through the HL7 standards process. Along with that, we've been calling them reference implementations, but really they're exemplar applications to exemplify the FHIR profiles and operations that would be used in the implementation guides. We create scenarios and sample data so that a developer can pick up the code, the sample code, not necessarily meant for production, and be able to see how the code exemplifies the IGs. And we think that's very valuable to the community. So what is the work that we do in Davinci, and why is this work really important? So what we're doing in this next set of slides is giving you a sense of where these groups of implementation guides fit together in a kind of a regulatory landscape. And so if we look at these first 4 guides, Payer Data Exchange, Formulary, Directory, and Patient Cost Transparency, the first 3 guides are published STU1 guides. They enable patients to access their clinical data from payers, which is that Payer Data Exchange. They allow the patients to use an app to gather their formulary data. So there's specific information about their formulary medications and the tiers, and be able to use a FHIR API and connect with a payer and find out which providers are in their network. And so you can imagine each of these being valuable in order to help patients be more engaged in their own care, be more knowledgeable, and with that they can work with their payers and providers to have shared decision making. So each of these first 3 guides were identified in the CMS 9115 final rule. And the question I get all the time is, where am I going to see FHIR in production? Well, number one, FHIR is already in production, but the payers are certainly now contributing to the production landscape, the production endpoints. And these will go live in just a few weeks. So in the beginning of July, you should be able to go to your payer and get your clinical data. And if you're an app developer, you may already be working on making your app using Smart on FHIR to allow the user to access their clinical data. So that's really powerful. Formulary as well needs to be available in July 1st, as well as the directory services. The fourth one, the patient cost transparency, is really complicated in that, number one, there's a lot of ambiguity about what that means to get a cost. I think it's easy when you go up to a cash register, or you hand over a credit card, or you actually have to pay. That's clearly a cost. But the information necessary to get to that cost is very high level when a care plan is initiated, all the way to what things have to happen when you deliver care. And it's one thing to have kind of standard care, and it's another when you have to deal with complexities or complications of care. And so we're working through how we can improve the cost transparency for patients so that they can have more information when they're early in their care and they're wanting to maybe shop for different services across different provider organizations, all the way to the point where in the No Surprises Act, in the Consolidated Appropriations Act from last fall, having a patient have an advanced explanation of benefits that summarizes what the best effort estimate would be for care, for whether it's a diagnostic study like an MRI or potentially for surgical studies. There's a lot of complexity to doing this, and so we are currently working on that, and we hopefully will be in public calls in the next few weeks when we've kind of wrapped our heads around what we want to accomplish. And ultimately, we want to get you to the point where a patient can do shopping like they do for travel, ideally. And that's the ultimate goal, but these are kind of our near-term regulatory goals. So with respect to the patient access API, those first 3, we are 3 of the 4 implementation guides that would be used to help patients with access to this data. The other is the Karen IG for Blue Button that gives them the EOB. So this is a view where the patient may have a consumer app or use their member portal on the right-hand side and be able to securely access their individual formulary information, their clinical information using US core resources, as well as their Karen Blue Button, their EOB data. This real-time benefits check we added in here because this is kind of a patient-facing implementation guide, but at this time there is no specific regulatory requirement for it. So it's just kind of a high-level view of how this would work and how the role of the payers and providers would flow to help support these implementation guides. Another important implementation guide that's kind of an underpinning guide that I didn't list in the first four because they're not in any kind of regulatory role is called the Health Record Exchange. And think of it as a library that we use to help not only our implementation guide developers, but also our community to understand where our guides fit into not only FHIR, US Core, but how we use our Davinci profiles across our implementation guides. Because, for example, FHIR has a coverage resource. That coverage resource was not profiled in US Core. So when we look at the Venn diagram, coverage is profiled in Davinci, and that's the right-hand side of that Venn diagram where it's FHIR and it's a Davinci profile, but it's not a US Core profile. And so we wanted folks to know that we work very closely with US Core, and because we're in the US realm, we, in every opportunity possible, use US Core as the basis of our profiles. And with the new rules in HL7, if we don't use a US Core profile when it exists, we have to give a good reason why. So where we use US Core and Davinci profiles, we may add extensions to them to carry additional information that payers need, but they are still valid US Core instances or profiles. So the HREX also lays out some of the technical approaches that we want to use, some things around security, first principles, and more about how we're going to use like provenance, which is very important for payers as well. So that's part of the library of Davinci implementation guides that you'll want to be familiar with. So just to jump in, so HREX is at that high level, but this is a particular example, this payer data exchange. And the idea here with this payer data exchange is that in combination with the claims data that is made available via the Karen guide, we take claims data and we create, whenever possible, FHIR US Core resources out of it. We recognize that claims data doesn't have the same kind of richness that the clinical data coming out of the EHR has, but it is important for patients and providers to have that information. But additionally, as payers receive more and more clinical data via FHIR and via US Core, we want to make that available in a couple of different scenarios. Number one is for the patient access API as FHIR resources and APIs available to the patient. So again, using that a non-proprietary app, or maybe not the app isn't proprietary, but the endpoint's not proprietary, or the format isn't proprietary. A patient can use an app to access their clinical data. That's great. But another example, and actually the first example we created for PDX was really the situation where you have a provider who is seeing the patient for the first time. Think about an ER visit, or you're on vacation and you're seeing a provider because you're injured, or you move to a new city for a new job or whatever reason, and you see a new provider. In today's landscape, you're often filling out some forms. Hopefully it's a digital form, but it may still be a paper form. And that form has to be translated and that data has to be entered into the EHR. So that's a burden to the staff. And it's not very high fidelity information. Patients, if you're lucky, will know their medications, but they might not know the exact dosages unless they have it with them. And so by having a provider, based on the fact that they're seeing the patient, make a request to the payer, they could receive the clinical data that's available on that patient and in FHIR format via FHIR APIs using this implementation guide. The benefit there as a provider is now I have a fuller view of what's happened with my patient in order to work with them in shared clinical decision-making. It doesn't even have to be a new patient. It could be a patient that I've referred to another provider for a referral. I may not know when that referral actually occurs. I might not get the data promptly from the specialist, but this approach may give me a way of getting that data until I get the information from the specialist. So very powerful, and it hopefully will reduce the delay in clinical decision-making as we wait for that clinical data. The next one, provider directory, pretty straightforward. Using a third-party app, a patient could hit a payer FHIR API and request all the payers, providers, and the pharmacies that are in a particular plan. That could be very useful at a patient when they're looking for a new provider, or looking for a specialist, or looking to make sure they use a pharmacy that's in their network. But you can also envision the same kind of functionality if you wanted to do shopping. And the app would be able to query a number of different payers and look at who's available. Because if I need to change plans, I want to know my provider, if I want to keep them, what plans they're on. So this could be very useful for that purpose. The formulary, again, two approaches with formulary, really. One that's very specific, that I as the patient want to know what the payer knows about my formulary, and whatever tiers that my drugs might be, so that if I want to, in the second case, work with my provider and change medications, I want to make sure that my provider knows what options are available for medications that are on my formulary. Because as a provider, that helps me in decisions when I don't have to pick a specific drug. If I have a choice of many drugs, I would certainly want to pick one that didn't cost the patient extra, and that one that was on their formulary. So formulary is another important implementation guide. So those were the ones that are kind of focused on patients. We have a couple of APIs or IGs that are good for payer-to-payer data exchange. You might ask, why is that important? That is important. Number one, it's in the CMS rule. The payer-to-payer exchange as a functional requirement is in that rule. And CMS pointed to, but didn't name, the Davinci Payer Data Exchange as the IG. We certainly think that that's the best way to do it, because it's FHIR-based and it's kind of standardized. But the idea here is that when a patient goes from payer A to payer B, and payer B is covered under the CMS rule, their Medicare Advantage or QHP or Qualified Health Plan under the Marketplace or CHIP or Medicaid, that the patient can ask for their previous payer to send over their clinical data. Today, that's the challenge, is that it can be done in a number of ways, SFTP or whatever. Ideally, both payers would use the PDX to do the query and response based on the member authorization, as well as the FHIR APIs for like $ everything. Of course, we would agree that the payer A wouldn't necessarily send over the financial data, but they could send over all the clinical data. So that's just allowing patients over time to continue to have a source of their clinical data in one place. Ideally, they stay at one provider, one EHR the whole lifetime, but we know that that doesn't happen. The second one is our coverage decision exchange. The difference in the two is that PCDE, which is that coverage decision exchange, is focused on services, medications, and clinical activities that are active, and along with that may require prior authorizations. So the scenario would be, I may have rheumatoid arthritis. I've been on rheumatoid arthritis medications that required a prior authorization. I've done all the work around that with my provider and my payer. It's authorized, I'm on the medication. And now I go to a new payer for whatever reason. Ideally, we as a healthcare community don't want that patient to have any break in what's working for them. And we don't want them to have to do anything extraordinary to make sure that that continues to happen. Today, if I go to that new payer, I may have to get that medication refilled or get the service done again, and I might have to go through a new prior authorization. That's a burden on my provider. It's a burden on me, and it's a potential for the delay because of burden prior authorization. So ideally, we would had the payer, my original payer, send over all this information related to my care, my active care, and the new payer could use that information and, but ideally, authorize the continuation of those services. And they could authorize it based on the clinical data alone, or if both payers, new and old, had used the same set of algorithms from one of the utilization management companies, and the new payer could say, oh, that first payer used a particular algorithm 1, 2, 3 and approved it. I use the same algorithm 1, 2, 3. I'll just go ahead and approve it. You can see how there's a lot of value for the patient in preventing that burden, administrative burden, and the prevention of any delays in care and continuity of treatment and care. So that's what PCD is. It's not a requirement, but yet, or at all as far as I know, but that's the value of this particular guide. So back to the peer-to-peer data exchange. This is a visual to help explain that we have a requirement coming up. The challenge is that requirement doesn't point to, in the regulation, a specific IG, so a technical specification, but we as a Davinci community believe that we should use that Davinci Payer Data Exchange, because by doing that, we're using FHIR, we have a long-term plan, and before the burden reduction CMS rule was kind of put into pause, the PDX Payer Data Exchange IG was actually named in that. But that wasn't named to be going into effect until 2023. And so ideally, we want to start that earlier, but it would, at this time, still be voluntary. But the benefit here is that we want to be able to advance interoperability by having everyone use PDX, but since it's not mandated, we as a Davinci community are agreeing that we would use PDX because the framework of that is already in place, or the foundations of it are already in place for the July deadline around the patient access API. So one thing that's important here to note is that terminology. Those of you who know me, I'm a terminologist at heart. And so peer-to-peer data, peer-to-peer API is a CMS term. The PDX and the Payer Data Exchange is a Davinci use case and implementation guide term. So just keep that in mind as you're hearing these different terms. Some of them are CMS terms, others are the FHIR Davinci community implementation guide terms. So I want to move really quickly because those are the core ones that are kind of regulatory things, so that we have a little time for Q&A at the end. This is the high-level view of what the payer coverage decision IG is around. It really talks about the old payer, sending that current treatments, diagnoses, anything around guideline references or utilization management references, any history of prior authorizations, if that's applicable, as well as any supporting documentation that original payer had, could be sent to that new payer and be utilized to do new utilization management reviews and minimize administrative burdens of collecting data and reworking the authorization process. So we have a few here guides, again, Payer Data Exchange for provider to payer. And I explained earlier that this is a great opportunity for payers to send information to providers to give providers a more complete view of patients' clinical data for decision-making. We also have a guide that we're finishing up our ballot reconciliation called Clinical Data Exchange. And that is all about getting information from payers, exchanging information, from providers back to payers for things like post-payment review, as well as sending information from providers to other providers. And the value here is that we can, much like we do for request of information in a paper space, we could structure that information request by the requester using FHIR. So we could say, please send me the observations, diagnoses, and diagnostic reports related to the encounter that occurred on June 9th, 2021. Or we could ask for very specific, give me the last hemoglobin A1C for the patient. And that is put into the request using FHIR task, sent to a provider, And that provider can, if the relationship is a high trust relationship, automatically execute on those searches using FHIR and return that information to the requester. Or if they want to review that request, they can review the request and then send it forward to be executed as a FHIR query and response. So there's a lot of value here because now we've eliminated the need essentially for a medical records HIM personnel to go dig into the EHR, find the data, collect it all, and then send it back to the requester. So really powerful for kind of administrative purposes, as well as for patient care when I'm referring a patient to a new provider and I might not have sent enough information along the way, and that specialist needs to request additional information. Or I could request information around my own patient who may have been discharged from the hospital and I haven't seen the discharge summary yet. The other implementation guides around notifications was in the CMS rule around ADT requirements. That rule didn't specify a specific technical requirement, and so a lot of organizations are using their V2 approaches to doing this, and that's fine. We thought it would be beneficial to create a FHIR approach to doing this ADT notification and using FHIR messaging. And so we've had actually a couple of organizations implement this already, and it's right now published, and we are on pause with this as we await some of the R5 and the backporting of the new subscriptions approach to doing notifications. So we are planning to update this implementation guide when there's a firmer ground on where subscriptions is going forward. And this is the big topic that everyone cares about right now. This collection of our 3 guides around prior authorization and reducing that prior authorization burden. And so we have 3 guides. They were named in some proposed rules. They're all in STU1 versions. And each of these guides answers one of the questions that all clinicians have to ask when they're ordering or want to order a service or a durable medical equipment or a drug on a patient. Number 1 is, does this patient, based on their plan, require a prior authorization? So this first guide using CDS hooks and a payer CDS service can send that request through the provider workflow when they're ordering it and get the response as a CDS hook card that says, nope, this doesn't require a prior authorization, please proceed. Awesome. If it does need a prior authorization, I ask the second question. Okay, what documentation do I need to substantiate this order, and how do I collect it? That's very burdensome for providers today because A, they don't know, and B, if they wanted to know, they'd have to go to a portal or have their office staff do it. So the second guide, Documentation Templates and Payer Rules, uses that launch parameter inside the smart card and either launches it as a Smart on FHIR app, or if it's enabled in the EHR could enable this natively to go to the payer's CDS endpoint or the Smart on FHIR endpoint, and the Smart on FHIR app or service could retrieve 2 FHIR resources. Number 1 is the questionnaire resource. It's actually 1 resource, but the questionnaire resource that essentially asks all the questions around gathering the information for a prior auth. And then number 2, embedded in that app would be some CQL. And that CQL would define what information goes into the questionnaire. So for example, if I needed to order oxygen on the patient and I needed to document that, that requirement for documentation set may say, well, you need a room air oxygen saturation that is less than 6 months old. The CQL would define that request. I need a pulse ox that's less than 6 months old. And by the way, here are the LOINC codes of labs that support this particular requirement. The app or the native EHR could execute that CQL and retrieve that data on behalf of the provider and then display it along with the other questionnaire components for the provider to validate, as well as add any information that is not already structured and codified in FHIR. The value here is that it may take just a little bit more time to review that information, But what it saves for the provider is what happens today, where I initiate an order, my back office fills out forms, and then comes back to me while I'm doing charts and says, Dr. Nguyen, this patient needed this previous lab, and we don't have it. So we have to have them come in and get that lab before we can get this authorized. Or, Dr. Nguyen, which of your notes or which of these things do we have to add and send back to the payer because we didn't document it in the prior authorization form. So we want to save you time, what we call that pajama time for the providers that have to deal with prior authorizations because they were incomplete when they were initiated. So that's where this documentation templates can support that and making it more complete. And then lastly, once I do the prior gather that information, I want to submit it to the payer and get as quickly as possible an adjudication so I can initiate this care. Today, we have the X12 278, which has less than 10%, as far as I've been told, adoption. And we have an approach now with FHIR to collect the clinical information, create a claim resource, and submit it to a FHIR endpoint where the vendor can then convert the data in the claim resource to a X12 278, send it to the payer, and then get a near real-time response in this particular workflow. Now, it is important to note that Davinci has received an exception, a HIPAA exception, so that we can do the pilot work to not use the 278 transactions, even though the payer may still need the data. So we could still use all the claim resource and the clinical data, but instead of sending it through as a 278 or 275, we send it through FHIR end-to-end. This exception is only available to Davinci payer members, and that's important right now because we need to show to the community that this can be done well and quickly in FHIR. And then once we are able to do that and report on that, the opportunities will hopefully increase for others to try to do it. Because if you're not already pretty mature in FHIR, you're probably not ready to do this level of FHIR work in this guide. So next up, so again, this is just a high level that coverage requirements discovery, asking for the whether or not the prior authorization was required. The CDS service returns a card, says that it is, and if it is, we launch a Smart on FHIR app or a native app to collect the data. Finally, I'll try to do this really quick. Quality improvement is really the next big layer, I think, of FHIR. There's been a ton of work with Measure IGs, CQL, QI Core, and what we've added in Davinci is the ability to take those core data and the resources and exchange them. So the data exchange for quality measures, along with the gaps in care that's part of it, allows a provider to ask a payer or another source, give me the gaps in care. What quality measures are incomplete for a list of patients? They get that back as a FHIR measure report. They use that information in their own backend to engage patients in closing gaps like immunizations, cancer screenings, etc. And as part of delivering the care, they're generating clinical data, and then the EHR makes that clinical data available via FHIR so that it could be submitted back to the payer or reported back to a measure authority. And then we can close that whole loop, ideally, using FHIR. And the first set of quality measures, because quality measures are really complicated, are really focused on the ones that are highly structured and that we could do relatively easy in pure FHIR. But the benefit here is the minimizing the administrative burden that organizations have today in managing their care gaps and reporting and gathering the information so that they can be reported back to a payer for their risk-based contracts or other contracts, as well as back to measure authorities. So the goal really is to automate much of this using FHIR, the quality measure IGs and other IGs, and to minimize that burden. The gaps in care is part of that DEQM. It's a subset of activities where we would use, ask for gaps in care on a single patient, or in combination with a member attribution or a list of patients, we can ask for the gaps in care. And so we've actually been able to demonstrate this in the Connectathons using the member attribution implementation guide as well as bulk FHIR. So finally, the member attribution guide is really a guide that allows payers and providers to exchange a list of patients that are attributed under a risk-based contract. And this is really important because patients go in and out of contracts all the time. And in our next iteration that we're hoping to start testing at the CMS Connectathon is a way of updating that list in a FHIR approach, as well as making it so that we can support the CMS data at point of care, so that it's a more fee for service and not a risk-based contract, so that when I see a patient, I filed a claim, I essentially establish my relationship with the patient, and then I can make that request for all the payer data on that patient. So it's another version of getting clinical data back to the providers so that they can have a more complete view of the patient's health history. I mentioned a few that we have coming up around risk adjustment. Right now, we're working on them. So it's actually not discovery, it's in flight right now. And we have calls on Thursdays around that. And then we're looking at some additional ones for the future around cost performance reports, lab reporting, and gathering data from patients as well. So with that, these slides will be available. You can find us on HL7's Confluence site at confluence.hl7.org. You can join our listservs. Our community calls are open, and we have our implementation guide dashboard where you can find out the status and quickly find where information is available, and the status of our guides and our implementer support, which is this. So if you're relatively new to this Davinci community, though you've been in FHIR, we try to provide as many resources as we can around our guides, our calls, our reference implementations, as well as testing tools that we use at Connectathons. So we want to encourage you to join our calls and participate. And I know I've run a little longer than I'd like. Feel free to reach out to me. We also have a session tomorrow that I'll go into some details of that implementer support site, so that if you're an implementer, you can learn more about how you would use these resources within your own organizations. So with that, I will pause and try to pull up, because I lost it on Whova, the Q&A. And Joshua, if you happen to have one ready for me, I'll...
Yep, I do. So Will is asking, do you think the sharing of data between payers will enable better longitudinality for claims-based EPI studies?
I'm going to say that yes, from off the bat. More data longitudinally will help with those EPI studies, but I guess I paused on the claims-based EPI studies. I would ask the folks who are doing things that are claims-based to look at how now we are combining the clinical data with the claims data and using them together. So that is where FHIR has really pushed the whole IT community to recognize that there's an intersection between this administrative data and this clinical data. And the CMS's Burden Reduction Office participated in a whole task force around this because it used to be that they were separate, and they shouldn't be separate anymore, especially around value-based care, where your payments and your claims are very closely connected to the clinical data that was derived as part of the patient care. Other questions?
At this point in time, I think that's the only one we have. We can give it just a minute here if people are still looking for it. It is in Whova, right next to the session where you clicked on the link to view this session.
So I'm also in Whova. I have my email up, and you can ask a question there. You can ask a question through Whova, and we'll keep monitoring it. And we'll see another question. No other questions, but thank you for joining the session and listening in. Please get engaged in the community. We are all both FHIR realists, but also FHIR evangelists. And we really want to leverage, much like you all do, how we can improve patient care using FHIR. Thanks
awesome.
Again.
Thank you so much, Viet, for that fantastic presentation on the expanding payer provider landscape in FHIR. And thank you all for joining. As he mentioned, you can always ask in Whova in the community or at chat.phir.org. Thank you very much.
Thanks, folks. Take care. Enjoy the rest of the Dev Days.